which we're going to address today here on along with Jim Peterson and Joe Reinhardt. You can talk to me, or you can offer up your opinion on the program today by picking up the phone and calling us at 4. Now, this article I referred to presents a comprehensive history of atheism, which is very well done, from colonial to present-day America. And it also establishes the basis of the national prejudice against atheists. However, what Seth fails to understand is that atheism is not a substitute belief system. Rather, it's a lifestyle void of beliefs, embracing instead knowledge and science. Okay, so how often have we heard the statement, for example, well, everybody's got to believe in something? We as atheists hear it very frequently. But we don't subscribe to it because we can live our lives without belief in something. Well, I think maybe we should start by talking about really what we mean by belief, especially as atheists. So, for example, if I say that I believe that Jim was going to show up for the show today, well, I have a basis for that belief, which is that I know that Jim exists and I know we're supposed to do the show. It doesn't mean he absolutely will be here. It just means that I believe he's going to be here because he's supposed to be here. And look, he did show up. But when religionists talk about belief, it's in something so abstract that it lacks any evidence of any kind. It's merely a story either handed down by somebody or written down in a book.
It's not just a matter of lacking evidence. It's a matter of the less evidence there is, the stronger the belief. And so if I thought Jim was going to show up for the show and he didn't show up one week, well, my faith or my belief in his reliability would go down a little bit. But if he failed to show up for several weeks in a row, it would go down to about zero. Whereas in religion, every time he failed to show up, the more certain I would be that his presence was an absolute certainty, and he'd probably arrive on a flying horse of some sort.
It's imminent. Any time now, I'm likely to show up. Now, I was a little unspecific about when I would appear next, but
For Halloween?
But perhaps, I mean, eons can pass before I might show up.
Well, in your case, a second is like 1,000 or 1,000,000 years, whatever it needs to be in order to account for the fossils.
That's right. In fact, you will be a fossil before I show up.
I'm already a fossil.
But we actually can live our lives without any abstract beliefs in how we came to be, what the world is all about, what happens to us after we die, and so on. And then religionists take that as a threat for some reason, that they have an abstract, undemonstratable belief, and we can live our lives completely independent of that. And I think the advantage is we are able to live without the dogma that's attendant with that belief, wouldn't you say? The rituals, the concepts of sin, of personal inadequacy and evil, that we don't need to incorporate into our lives.
Well, I think you have to take into consideration how we are formed as human beings. Human beings are not born, we are made. We are made of all the experiences that we have after birth. We have our parents, we have our teachers, ministers, government officials. We have the experience of living, of interacting with media, with television, radio, reading books and magazines. We have our friends. We have an extraordinary network of influences that add something to who we are, little bits and pieces here and there that account for the existence of us. And no less than anything else, religion is comprised of these bits and pieces. So, and also many parents take it as being necessary to expose their children at a very young age to religious belief systems. They take them to be baptized or confirmed or have a bar mitzvah, this, that, and the other thing, and or a bat mitzvah, as the case may be. But in any case, we are necessarily comprised of these experiences and give them up only with the greatest reluctance, because they are part and parcel of who we are. So it's very difficult to break free of that. And this is why there are relatively few atheists, that is, people who have actually studied these matters and these questions and have come to certain contrary beliefs, if you will, about the nature of our world and the nature of themselves. What's your experience been like?
Well, I hear not infrequently about people experiencing an epiphany of some sort, and I don't put much credence in those stories. I agree with you, Jim, that what we are and what our opinions and our views are politically and religiously and socially are arrived at over a period of time. And in much of that is beyond our control. We can't control the types and frequency of various stimuli that we receive. So the idea that, again, it isn't something that changes. It can be changed simply by an act of will is pretty evident by the fact that people don't change religion week to week like they change their clothing. You know, people don't decide, well, it's Friday, I guess I'll be a Mormon today, and on weekends, you know, I prefer simply to be Jewish.
Save Saturday for the Adventists, though.
Yeah, right. So, again, I think it is something, it's a conclusion that we arrive at over a long period of time, and people, again, feel maybe threatened, maybe upset. I think, luckily, people are becoming more tolerant towards diversity and more accepting of people whose views differ radically from their own. It wasn't too long ago that your near future consisted of fire or rope if you expressed your opinion too freely.
Mm-hmm. Ed, you've mentioned in the past that you're one of those lucky few of us who've had the opportunity to grow up in a family of people who did not harbor religious beliefs. How did your parents break free of what I presume was a standard connection to some religion?
I'm not sure that I ever asked them. I just always knew them to be atheists. I never questioned why, because what they told me about religion made so much sense, which is basically that it's all just a fantasy. That there were no gods there, and we did not need to subscribe to that dogma, whatever it was, which I, of course, then was not familiar with because I didn't go to church. I didn't know the rituals. I wasn't familiar with these concepts of sin and being taught about personal inadequacy by virtue of existence that plagues other people. So, I just didn't even focus on those things. I thought about what I wanted to do with my life and what I enjoyed doing and the friends that I was with. One thing I notice about religionists, though, is the way, and I see it coming about even more prominently in this current administration that's running our government, both our state and our federal government, is the challenge to science and what science is and how we should appraise it. It seems to be very suspect to the religionist and the conservative movement, as if science is just something people make up, science is something people engage in order to get grants or an income, and that science is highly questionable and something we should challenge entirely. And I think that's one place where an atheist is going to differ significantly from a Christian, is that an atheist understands that science isn't on an equal plane with religious dogma or belief, but that science actually has foundations to it. The definition of science is twofold. Number one, the state of knowing, knowledge as distinguished from ignorance or misunderstanding, and also the knowledge covering general truths or the operation of general laws, especially as obtained and tested through the scientific method, something I think that religionists are really ignorant of. They don't understand the scientific method, that science comes about because it's testable and it's provable and it's repeatable. It isn't just something made up because somebody doesn't like what religion is
Well,
talking.
largely, they see it as a competition for
Right,
religion,
right.
and that, every time there's a scientific advance, then any supernatural claim for that event has to retreat, so their world continues to shrink. I'd like to read just a sentence or two from this article that you mentioned a minute ago about the dislike for atheism by Daniel Seeger. American antipathy for atheism is as old as America. Again, this is important for people who say that we were founded as a Christian nation.
With kindest respect, it's really older because it started with the colonies, right?
started-
So it's older than America
Started
in
with
America.
the invention of religion. Although many colonists came to this country seeking to practice their own faith, they brought with them a notion of religious liberty that extended only to other religions. True religious liberty was rare in the colonies. Dissenters were fined, flogged, jailed, and sometimes hanged. Yet, surprisingly, no atheist was ever executed. So, one of the things that affected Thomas Jefferson's views on religion when he was a young man was he saw Baptists being whipped in the streets, stripped bare to the waist and whipped in the streets.
How could somebody be hanged but not executed?
No, what he said was atheists. No atheists
atheist
were
was ever
because
executed.
right.
Other
because most
religious
people,
believers.
yeah, they were too afraid to
Right.
admit they were atheists if they were, because they knew they were going to be at the end of a hangman's noose.
And a lot of the so-called religious tolerance and liberty in the early colonies was limited to the fact that if you were a Catholic, I think you went to Rhode Island, and if you were a Presbyterian, you went to
Right.
Pennsylvania, and so
Well,
the-
if you were Catholic, you went to Maryland.
Maryland, okay,
Yes.
I'll go for that, wherever, but the point was that they had their own bailiwick, sort of like a gang has its own territory.
That's right.
And as long as you stayed on your own turf, you didn't have any problem. But as soon as some Catholic wandered out of Maryland for the purpose of corrupting the children of the people who lived in Virginia, their chances of being beaten, hanged, or whatever were way up.
But that's
Yeah.
another fascinating point that's made in the article, is the fact that you had so much religiosity in the colonies that then Jefferson comes along and produces a constitution that is totally secular. In fact, the only reference to any God in it is when they define the date when it's signed, the year of our Lord. And they include in that constitution, which is still effective today, a disclaimer that no religious test shall be given in order to hold public office.
Article 6.
Right.
But of course, it's the only way they could have successfully pulled off the American Revolution, because as you pointed out, all of these colonies were founded on particular religious traditions. And so the only way to get them all together was to propose that a secular goal be pursued. That is the goal of independence. And they all had to work together, or they would all, as Benjamin Franklin said, be hung separately.
They hang separately.
So it made sense then that we say nothing about religion, that we get together on those things in which we do agree, and it turns out that those are secular projects. And
Sure, and yet now we
and
hear
it works.
the propaganda to the opposite effect, that all of our civil liberties, our democratic process, and our Constitution came to us out of the Bible, whereas we as atheists, who are objective and impartial about it, understand that none of those elements exist in the Bible at all.
I thought it was based on the Book of Kings.
Right, right, because if this was a Christian nation, it would be a kingdom. You wouldn't have civil liberties, you wouldn't have an opportunity to vote, your leader would be divinely ordained, right?
Well, from the colonist point of view, their entire experience in the old world was with kings and aristocracy.
Right.
No one knew anything about democracy. What the heck is that?
Even if it were a disaster, it couldn't be much worse than what they left behind.
Exactly. Especially, and again, another part of that experience was the almost continual religious conflicts that were going on in Europe prior to and during the American Revolution. So our leaders of the time acknowledged this, could see it, could see the bad effects, and realized that if you're going to construct a country, why not construct one that would try to avoid these religious conflicts and have it be secular? And it made sense then, and still makes sense, and has made sense to the entire rest of the world. Every successive institution that has influenced human development since then and I think here mainly I'm thinking about the United Nations, has made it a big point to secure the people of the world in their religious liberty as belonging to the individual and not to be left to the states, the individual countries and so forth to espouse, although many of them do, of course, even in Europe still.
So even though we had a secular constitution, all but 3 states passed Sabbatarian laws, which were imposed on everyone, including religious observers whose Sabbath didn't even fall on Sunday, like the Seventh-day Adventists who actually know how to read a calendar, right? The remnants of that is the blue laws, which are really limited, I think, exclusively by any standards today to simply the sale of alcohol on Sunday. But one Jewish merchant took his case all the way to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, only to be denied an exemption because, in the words of the court, here's a quote, "Whatever strikes at the root of Christianity tends manifestly to the dissolution of civil government," unquote. So here you have a judge who is so confused that he thinks that the only way you can create a civil society is with Christianity.
Back in the 60s, I recall an event where the St. Petersburg police raided a dance club, a bar, called the Blue Room, as a matter of fact. And anyway, they raided it and arrested the manager and et cetera for dancing on a Sunday. So those types of blue laws aren't that old, and they said, well, we didn't want to have to enforce it, but it's on the books. So the owner of the club sued the city of St. Petersburg because they had green and white uniforms and police cars, and there was a county ordinance that said only the sheriff's department could have green and white colors for their department. So they were in violation of the law, and they wanted it enforced. So the county got rid of both laws.
All wise on their part.
I think another misconception about atheism is that it really seems to want to serve as a substitution for the so-called morality of Christianity, but that tends to overdefine atheism. Atheism is nothing more than a rejection of the supernatural. It doesn't advocate for human rights or civil rights, any particular political party, anything of the sort. Atheism is simply a rejection of the supernatural. So, of course, atheists can be holding up liquor stores, child molesters, they can be mass murderers. It doesn't really denigrate
They could be
atheism.
philanthropists.
Yes, and are.
And even worse, some of them are reputedly Republican.
Horrors.
But I think that's why you sometimes see Christians saying, well, atheism has no morality and there is no foundation for morality.
That's absolutely true. We have no morality. It has nothing to do with atheism at all. Atheism is not a belief. It is a conclusion. Okay?
Right.
Well, it should be stated, however, that individual atheists are moral people, at least most of the ones that I've ever
Now I
known.
would dispute that because to my understanding is morality is biblically defined. Ethics is what we deal with as humans relating to each other and trying to have a functional society.
Well, that's an interesting argument right there. But I do think, however, that morality as the expression of an ethical philosophy in a practical way, we do have a moral relationship amongst ourselves. I mean, not just here in this room, but everyone has a moral relationship with everyone else. And atheists are no exception to this, in that they treat their fellow, or at least they can, treat their fellow human beings fairly and work within a given society along the ethical guidelines that are generally understood. However, atheism, as you rightly pointed out, has nothing to do with this. Atheism is that single point that says there is not necessarily any supernatural or theistic foundation for anything. Ethics, morality, ontology,
And
you
that-
can go on and on.
And that's based on the evidence available.
That's right.
It's subject to change.
But the reason I take my position
Quite
is
right.
because morality is often something, or at least as I understand it, morality is what is derived from religious ideology. It's immoral to have sex with somebody unless you're married. Is it unethical? No, it's what
could
the
be.
religion imposes upon us, and so we are deemed as immoral people because we're atheists, because we don't follow these dogmatic and ritualistic laws imposed on us by religion. But we're ethical people because we treat each other ethically. We don't steal from each other.
I think the variation is biblical or religious morality versus secular morality. Secular morality is based on all of the rationales that you just described.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I'm just putting
And
it in
hence, it's automatically more ethical because it's not the reaction of an automaton to some edict from above. And if God tells you that you need to kill everybody in this village and leave nothing that breatheth, you can decide for yourself that that's not moral.
And as some people understand morality, it is not necessarily religious based. It is based on whatever is the prevailing understanding about the relationships between people. I mean, that's what it is really, and where it sprang from. The whole ancient man would, in dealing with others, other hunter-gatherers, for instance, would make arrangements with them so that each would respect the other's hunt, perhaps the carcass that they happen to.
Enlightened
or-
self-interest.
Yes, exactly.
All right,
And
I'm
this
going to
is-
look
and this
that up for
works.
next week's program and see what Webster says about that,
Alrighty.
okay? And so right now, we're going to take a short little break to tell you about Atheists of Florida, because you might be an atheist and not really know it, or you might be an agnostic who should be an atheist. But the point is, if you're fed up with the people who are trying to impose religion on you, and you would prefer to be around people who live their lives quite happily without ever dealing with religion, people who don't even say God bless you if you sneeze, you might be interested in learning about Atheists of Florida. We're going to tell you about that right now, and then return with more of this conversation here on the Tan Talk Radio Network.
Amen.
So tight.
Atheists of Florida is a nonprofit membership organization founded in 1992. For over 25 years, Atheists of Florida has brought atheists together to address state-church separation issues, provide legal assistance in cases of religious discrimination in employment or educational institutions, help atheists meet others who want to live their lives free of religion, and produce the Atheist Forum. For membership information, visit our website at atheistofflorida.com, where you'll find our newsletters, annual reports, statement of purpose, and information about meetings and events. That's atheistofflorida.com. Ed Golly with Joe Reinhardt and Jim Peterson in the Tan Talk Network with the most interesting program on the network, the Atheist Forum. We might be
Said
the only ones that
modestly.
think so, but at least that's 3 out of 3. I was
It's
in
unanimous.
a shop the other day, and I saw a little sign on the wall that had a picture of about a 6-year-old little girl. It was a drawing, so she had pigtails and great big blue eyes. And at the top, it said something to the effect that I don't hate atheists. And then underneath, at the bottom, it says, I don't understand why they hate me for believing in God. So the agitation is right there, the implication that atheists hate people who believe in any gods. Well, actually, most of us as atheists don't really question whether people that we know, encounter, meet, or do business with believe in any gods. And we don't hate them. We just simply question what it is that they believe. But this was an agitative sign suggesting that, we shouldn't trust atheists. We should hate them because they hate us. Says who? Says nobody. The thing is that gets my attention is that Christianity demands that its adherents seek to convert non-believers to their beliefs. That's one of the tenets of Christianity, to go out and proselytize and convert everybody and have everybody kneeling at the foot of Jesus and whatever. And that, of course, bothers us because we don't need somebody proselytizing to us. Atheists realize that they cannot reason with believers because believers believe what they believe without any evidence. Therefore, they're, in our opinion, irrational. But instead, we seek to preserve and protect our civil liberties as defined in the Constitution. That's what we're all about as Atheists of Florida. Not to go out and incite people to burn down churches, but to protect our civil liberties that are defined in the Constitution and have been throughout the history of this country, that we see certain politicians trying to whittle away at to create the illusion that we are a Christian nation, that we owe our liberties to the Bible and Christianity, all of which is not true. Joe?
All right, so I have today's quote, which is from the high priest of atheism himself, Richard Dawkins. He says, "I am against religion because it teaches us to be satisfied with not understanding the world." I think that pretty well speaks for itself. I want to go on and quote another line here from Daniel Seeger, whose article we've been discussing all afternoon. "Some believers, meanwhile, use atheism to discredit anyone with whom they do not agree. You're an atheist, therefore you must be wrong, you must be bad." Atheists, by the way, do not hate God. They do not hate the Easter Bunny. They don't hate the Tooth Fairy. And they don't hate believers. We act on the same rule that believers supposedly do, which is to love the sinner and hate the sin. And I may love the believer and hate the belief. I think that's equally possible, regardless of which side of the aisle you happen to be standing on. So I think that will clear up the hate issue a little bit. And imagine, since non-believers, especially on a global scale, really are a very small minority, how difficult it would be to go through life hating 95% of your fellow human beings. That's too much work.
Yes, that's a heavy burden to carry.
Oh, it is.
And the whole notion of it goes against the essential dynamism is largely composed. It's the reason why we're here, sitting in front of these microphones connected to a transmitter that is getting the signal out to potentially millions of people all around the world. And that is that our understanding of ourselves and the world, the physical world and its processes, including biology and everything else, is what helps us to grow, to become who we are. I mean, we cannot imagine a world in which we did not exist the way we are. And that includes religious believers who every day take advantage of getting out to their car and turn the key and it works.
And the expanse of things that we have to marvel at, the entire universe compared to a burning bush.
Now, let's not say anything bad about our former president.
The author does elaborate extensively on the history of atheism and the fact that those who even question religion were deemed to be atheists even when they weren't. A lot of them were deists and subscribed to the idea that a particular, if God created everything, then stood back to see what happened and didn't interact with the world. But then came even though we were making progress, I think, toward weaning ourselves away from religion, along came the Cold War. And it wasn't politics or economics, some said, that distinguished America from its enemies. It became religiosity. I think that's because at the birth of the Cold War, after the Second World War, most people in this country had lived through the Great Depression, and they understood that capitalism was by no means a guarantee of a prosperous economy that would provide a good living for everybody, because they'd lived through a crushing capitalist depression. Whereas the communists were over there in the Soviet Union saying, look, we're going to manage production so that everybody has a job. We don't go into a cyclical economy of boom and bust. And those who have, everybody will have a job, everybody will have a house to live in, everybody will have dinner and an education and a good middle class standard of living. How to delineate the difference? How do we convince our people that our system is better when everybody could remember the Depression? And it became very simple. God is on our side, end of story. We
Right.
know the religionists love simple answers, right? Everything's good or evil or right or wrong. And so by simply declaring, without any evidence, that this God endorsed a nation that had engaged in slavery, genocide, racism, hostility toward women, oppression of women, and so, but God still thinks we're the good guys, so that's all you need to know. Capitalism is the system that God looks down on with most favoritism, and atheism became inexorably linked with communism.
In defense of America, the activities you just described are common to just about every nation I ever
Yes.
heard of.
Sure.
Yes. There is no people on earth who does not have a long history of the oppression of other people whenever they could have that opportunity.
Sure, they're called a colonialism.
Yes, exactly, among other things.
You're called nationalists.
Nationalists.
But here was a Catholic congressman named Louis Rabot who declared on the floor of the House of Representatives, quote, "From the root of atheism stems the evil weed of communism." So right then and there, if you simply rejected religion because you saw no evidence of it, you were then immediately linked to being an evil, bad guy, anti-American, anti-patriotic communist.
In your description of communists and how they represented themselves during the 1930s, what they were presenting to American workers at the time was an ideal version of what they hoped would be the final outcome of their political philosophy. And it's one with which I very much concur. However, they didn't tell you about what was really going on in the Soviet Union, the gulags, the repression, the pogroms, the very poor standard of living, and so on and so forth. You have to understand that Russia in 1917 through 20, after the revolution, was an extremely poor country, one of the poorest countries in Europe. And one thing that people seldom realize is that the United States and all the Allied powers invaded Russia and occupied it for about 6 months or so.
The Germans killed about 20 million Russians in World War II.
That's right.
More Russian civilians than military combatants were.
And unfortunately, they were burdened by the leadership of Joseph Stalin, who it turns out was rather a poor commander.
Well, all that's fine, but the
And the
point
seminaries
is
too.
simply that, yes,
Yes,
that the connection was made between communism, which was considered the ultimate enemy of capitalism, and the American way and freedom and civil liberties and all of this stuff, and then atheists consequently were linked to that. So we were really not welcome in our own country simply because we didn't believe something for which there was no evidence. And through this time, and by the way,
And you're
I'm
right.
referring more to the 50s than the 30s, after the war, when we started to see the imposition of religion in America in its national institutions. So, for example, from 53 to 57, a prayer breakfast began to appear on the White House calendar. A prayer room opened in the Capitol. And on all of our currency, we now saw the phrase, "In God We Trust." We know that's our state national motto. The quote, the term "under God" was inserted into the Pledge of Allegiance, which converted it into a prayer of allegiance. And even the national motto that the founders had established, which was the "E pluribus unum," was now it just proved too secular for the times, and essentially has been converted into "In God We Trust," in spite of the fact that we can't demonstrate any way that we trust in any God for anything.
E pluribus unum, by the way, means, if you expand it out to what it should mean, is out of the strength of many, we are one people. And that is very clearly a secular goal.
It's also an obsolete one under the present administration because they don't want people who are different coming into the country anymore. We're ready to send the troops and just shoot them down when they try to get across the border, right? The caravans, if they can ever make it this far.
Out of the
And so
strength
it's,
of
yeah, we see nationalism being really fueled by the idea that we don't, or the nationalists don't want the diversity in the culture that we have. They want to oppress that. We're hardly a nation
Well,
of diversity,
You know how during the
that
Civil
welcomes diversity, I should
during
say.
the Civil War they used the Bible to prove slavery was good, or they used it to prove bad it was bad. As such examples with itself. But on the subject of atheists, it is absolutely perfectly clear. So it should come as no surprise that as a consequence of what I'm about to repeat, that atheists have sort of been looked at rather dimly for millennia. The Bible says that the fool hath said in his heart that there is no God. Non-believers are abominations. They are evil, and they are liars, and they do no good, not one. Okay? Imagine saying something like that about any group on this planet today. You'd be so overwhelmed by the social justice warriors that you'd have to go hide out with the woman that testified against Judge Kavanaugh.
And also imagine, if you can, this same ideology, the same phrases being repeated over and over and over again over thousands of generations.
But they must be true, and they must be morally correct, because God himself has given us this information.
Mhm.
So much for religious morality.
And of course, we all know what God is being which God is being referred to, right? Even though the courts will uphold this idea of ceremonial deism, we know darn good and well that when the politicians impose this concept of God as being an integral part of our whole fabric as America, they're referring to the Christian God. Muslim gods are not welcome. Native Indian gods are brushed aside.
It wasn't Vishnu.
Right. It wasn't Thor or Saturn or Venus or any of them. It is
There are
the Christian God.
billions of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so the courts began upholding this concept of this, what they call ceremonial deism. It's a phrase that was coined by a Yale Law School dean in 1962, and in the decades since, it's been used by court after court to explain exceptions to the First Amendment, like saying, God bless you when someone sneezes. The courts concluded that under God's and in God we trust are innocuous, and they belong to the realm of patriotism and not prayer.
Just to give you an example of how we can rely on any religious ideas that come out of Yale in particular.
I know where you're going.
At one time, the Yale president, his name was Dwight, said that we ought not to vaccinate people for smallpox, because if God wanted you to die from smallpox, it was your duty in the hand of Providence
To drop dead.
to just die from smallpox. So, again, to quote Robert Ingersoll, based on the information that the folks from Yale have given us in the past on these subjects, it would be almost impossible to underestimate the value of their opinion on any current subject.
Yeah. So where would we be if we really did trust in a God? Would we have ever developed a vaccination for smallpox, or would we deal with addressing cancer?
We'll be living in tents and caves.
Sure, because anything that afflicts us, we would deem to be God's will, and who are we to correct that, right? When the God knows everything.
The first woman to use an anesthetic in childbirth was burned alive, and her surgeon on the grounds of the castle in Scotland.
Oh, you might know that.
But
Anyway,
because when God tossed Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden, he said that women would suffer from pain in childbirth, and it was held to be an imposition on the hand of Providence.
so as men, it's our duty to make women suffer. Is that what you're saying?
I'm doing my part. I'm doing my part to disappoint him.
We're bad. But,
Oh, come on, people.
but
Now, and here's another misconception about atheism, is that a large percentage of our population today is defining themselves as nuns, meaning they subscribe to no religion, but that does not necessarily make them atheists. We cannot claim somebody who simply says they're a nun. It's a misconception sometimes, I think, among atheists to say, well, she's, 24% of us now reject religion. Not necessarily. People have a lot of unusual ideas about religions or gods, divinity, that falls outside the realm of the conventional religions. So they declare themselves as nuns, but may still be religionists. Even between atheists, agnostics, and humanists, there's a big difference, even though all seem to be pretty much sitting on the same bench. The atheist says he rejects all concepts of the supernatural. The agnostic says, well, it may be true, I just haven't seen any evidence. And of course, the humanist then goes on, well, you can tell us better than either of us, Joe or
I'm
I,
Jim.
that the humanist actually relies on a manifesto that establishes certain things that every human should have an inherent birthright to.
You know, since atheism, atheists aren't sure that they don't make statements like, oh, there are no gods, period. They make statements like, based on the lousy evidence available, my belief is that there are no gods or supernatural beings.
Well,
And
see-
so the difference between that and agnosticism, I've seen dozens of explanations. I can't tell the difference. An agnostic is a person who, for various reasons, feels safer calling himself an agnostic. But I can't tell them apart.
But
I don't look
simply-
like an atheist.
It's simply a question of the fact that we can find, as an atheist, and I am a humanist, by the way, and also an atheist, and the two are not at all incompatible. But as an atheist, I can find no evidence that indicates that there is a God.
And as an atheist, I know you never will, because I understand that all gods were simply an idea dreamed up by our ancestors to explain a world that they lacked adequate science to understand.
I'll
So
admit
there's-
I'm not looking very hard.
But humanism does have a manifesto, doesn't it?
Well, there are in fact 3 manifestos
There
at
you
least,
go,
maybe
see.
4
So,
at this
yes.
point.
So that goes far beyond what an atheist is, who simply says, I reject the supernatural.
Well, yeah, it should be said that the humanist manifestos are declarations of philosophical and social import. They do not pretend to establish any sort of ontology of what exists or what doesn't exist. There's nothing to say about God, except that one should be reliant on reason as the primary instrument to make judgments about religious claims.
But doesn't humanism imply that humans, by virtue of being born, have certain inalienable rights?
Well, only to the extent that they're born into a society which honors those rights.
Right.
But if a baby is born on some island somewhere, then well, you're just out of luck in terms
Exactly.
of growth or anything else.
Right. Rights are what a society agrees to grant its population,
That's right.
and similarly
them.
has the ability to grant also. So, for example, in the United States, you do not have a right to health care. You can't take your kid to any dentist and say, I want my kid to have a checkup and fill 2 cavities. So if you can't pay the bill, get lost. You don't have a right to health care like you do in every other industrialized nation in
Brings up
the
a
world.
quibble on the meaning of the word right. I mean, if it's your right, then it's your right regardless of the circumstances. It's regardless of whether you actually are given that right is honored. But you have the right to health care, whether you're born on an island somewhere, whether you're born in
Yes.
China or in downtown St. Petersburg.
If there's
right
health care available, you have a right to
Well,
it.
let him finish.
A right is inalienable. It doesn't mean that, again, that you're going to receive it, but you have a right to a minimum health level, a minimum nutrition level, certain minimum housing requirements.
What about
respect
a
that-
right to immigrate to any country you want to go to?
I don't think that's a right.
I have heard that expressed in a film that I saw about the overwhelming number of migrants in the world today that have been displaced by civil wars, and at the very end, this is exactly what the moderator said.
They are.
If you were born in the world, you have the right to go anywhere you want and live anywhere you want. And I'm with you. I don't agree with that. You can't do that in the vastly overpopulated world we live in today.
Yeah,
But some people do think that.
to make that right actually workable would require such a colossal change in the structure of both society as it now exists and human nature as it now exists.
But we have two existing examples, the United States, between the states, and the European Union, which established open borders.
Open borders, right?
And so, it can be done.
Yeah, you can't
And as
have any
humankind
tolls
advances through
between
time.
states, right? Yeah.
yeah,
Well, see, what I thought you were
we
gonna
can do
say is you have the right to live in any state you want as an American.
Right.
But if you're a Mexican, you don't have the right to come here and live
That's
in
true.
any state at all. And as far as Europe goes, does that also apply? Can somebody from Germany go live in Portugal? 'Cause you
Well,
can
as I
know,
live there,
yes,
but you're
yes.
not a
Well, it
inherent
involves their
citizen.
possessions too. So if you live in Dutch New Guinea, you can move to Amsterdam and there you go.
Yes, that's another good example. But there are reasons to suppose that in the future, these are just two, the European Union and the United States and certain other parts of the world have arrangements where people can move around freely. And I think we can expect that as humanity continues to grow and we become more cooperative and progress, shall I say, is being made in every hand, we can expect that there will be a great expansion of human freedom. Now, this is not guaranteed by any means. There are forces in the world alive today that would like to forestall any development of this kind.
That-
They're living in the past.
The pendulum
They would
is
like to
always
live there.
swinging.
It is.
As long as
It's up
you're
to
on the
us.
topic of internationalism, I thought I would point out something I saw in the article that got my attention also, which is at the end of the Obama administration, Congress passed and the president signed a new version of the International Religious Freedom Act that officially included non-believers. So we're seeing some progress in this country, at least we were back then. Here's what it said, quote, "The freedom of thought, conscience, and religion is understood to protect theistic and non-theistic beliefs and the right not to profess or practice any religion."
As our numbers increase, we will automatically gain more rights or more recognition of our rights. Conversely, as our numbers increase and the number of believers and non-believers begins to be more equal, or non-believers even become a minority, the conflict that will result will increase. All you have to do is look at the civil rights movement in the states where there were almost no blacks. There was no problem with civil rights. Blacks came and went as free as they pleased. But in states where 55% of them was black and 45% were white, they had to make sure that none of those blacks could vote, right?
Exactly.
So,
And they're still working on it.
so the Jim Crow laws and
Speaking of Florida.
yeah, right. So the Jim Crow laws and the KKK and the lynchings were all designed to make sure that the whites could maintain control. And we'll see that in religion. As we gain numbers and power in religion, the conflict will increase. I have said many times, they have $1 trillion cash cow. They're not going to give that up without a fight.
No, they aren't.
The thing that got my attention about that, though, was they said non-theistic beliefs. That, to me, is an oxymoron. If you're non-theistic, you don't have beliefs, as we discussed earlier in the program. Let's see, we've got about a minute left, so do you have any final questions, comments, or insults?
Insults.
Think on your feet. Geez, guys, come on. Well, listen, our website
I have
is
several
over.
insults, but I'm trying to be polite.
Still,
Very
all right.
nice people here. We don't.
If you'd like to find out more about Atheists of Florida, if you like our program, or you'd like to hear some archives of it, you can find us at talk.aof.ngo. We're going to be at the St. Pete Times Festival of Reading, where you will be able to insult an atheist to his face, to Joe's face. That'll be down at the St. Pete campus of the USF on November 17th. We're always the most fun place to be.
That's right.
It's where all the smart people are hanging out.
And
So,
Just
come
look
down
for
and join
the
us.
booth that has most people in front of it and use your elbows.
And free books. We actually give out free books. We've been so inundated with them over the years that we we just can't even sell them anymore. We just give them away. So come on down and meet us and find out more about atheism, what we think, and why we think it. Tell your friends, tell your worst enemies about the Atheist Forum, and I hope you'll join us again next week here on the Tan Talk Radio Network. Now, along with Joe Reinhardt and Jim Peterson, I'm Ed Golly reminding you, if the story seems just a little too implausible to be true, don't believe it just because somebody wrote it down.
Make them prove it.
You have been listening to the Atheist Forum. To learn more about Atheists of Florida, visit our website at atheistofflorida.com. Continue the discussion on our website, talk.aof.ngo. And join us again next Friday for another edition of the Atheist Forum here on Tan Talk 1340. Atheists of Florida is a nonprofit membership
WTAN, Clearwater,
FM 106.1,
WDCF, Dade City, Tampa Bay, WZHR, Zephyr Hills.
FM 104.3.
Listen.
Using a fingerprint and DNA, the FBI has made a quick arrest in the national manhunt to end the campaign of suspicious packages. The suspect is 56-year-old Cesar Sayoc Jr. of Florida. Attorney General Jeff Sessions.
They have moved swiftly and professionally, using extraordinary technical expertise to apprehend the one alleged responsible.
President Trump praised law enforcement.
These terrorizing acts are despicable and have no place in our country.
Sayoc's arrest record includes an incident in 2002 described as a threat to bomb. Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen urges everyone to be vigilant.
If you notice a strange package or if you see something that appears out of the ordinary, do not remain silent. If you see something, say something.
Bomb technicians are checking out 2 more suspicious packages. They were discovered today at addresses in California. I'm Mike Moss. Active duty troops will be deployed to the U.S.-Mexico border.
Defense Secretary James Mattis has approved a request from the Department of Homeland Security to send the troops to the border. The limited operation will start on Tuesday and end on December 15th. President Trump had vowed to send in the troops to stop the migrant caravan from Central America. Secretary Mattis's order does not specify how many troops will be sent to the border. Instead, it allows the Pentagon to gauge the number of troops needed to complete the operation. Officials say the troops will not be in forward operating positions, but instead will support engineering, planning, and communications efforts. Linda Kenyon, Washington.
A federal judge today rejected a bid by the Trump administration to halt a trial set to start November 5th that would test the legality of its contentious decision to ask people taking part in the 2020 census whether they are citizens. GDP.
Now what have I done? Here we go. So the next group, now the atheists, slobs.